Hello, everyone. Welcome to our February Lunch and Learn with Nicole Reardon. She is our Director of Safety Programs here at Spotlight Solutions, and we're really happy to have her and be hearing from her today. Nicole's going to talk to us about local safety permitting regulations for biotechs in Massachusetts, and she's going to be talking to us about the current map and the future trends of what to expect. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Nicole. Thanks for being here, Nicole.
Thanks, Melody. Let's just get the slide up here. Perfect. All right, great. So I'm Nicole Reardon, Director of Safety Programs with Spotlight. Today's Lunch and Learn will be focused on safety permitting regulations for biotechs. I'm going to be focusing on biosafety permitting and also flammables permitting and trends that are going on that we're seeing in Massachusetts. So kind of before we dive deeper into the local regulations, I wanted to give a little bit of the lay of the land about as far as biosafety regulations go. So the most common drivers for formal adherence to these regulations are federal funding, corporate best practices, and local ordinances. So most academic institutions fall under this federal funding bucket if they receive funding from the NIH or the NSF, Department of Defense, DARPA, any of these organizations, they would fall under this sort of federal funding category. And then moving over to the corporate best practices, these are where you'll find your large biotechs and life sciences institutions. So they really develop these programs as part of their internal corporate safety policies. And then really what we're going to focus on today are the local ordinances. So these are these city and town requirements that are required for work with regulated material in specific cities and towns, and they have their own specific set of regulations. So local ordinances do vary quite significantly from place to place, but there are typically some standard features that apply to all of them. So typically they will formally cite the NIH guidelines and they'll loosely base expectations on the BMBL. They tend to require IBCs, but there are a lot of modifications or specific requirements for each city and town that we work in. Especially for IBCs. They convey review and permit granting authority to a board of health or a biosafety committee, or sometimes to both. And then most times they request access to facilities to do site inspections or walkthroughs prior to granting permits. And then typically there's an initial permit cycle. So when you first apply for your permit, if you are starting out brand new in a city or town, or if you move to a different city or town, and then also an annual renewal cycle. And those annual renewal deadlines will vary greatly from place to place. So some common restrictions that we see across the board, we typically see that no rDNA or synthetic nucleic acid work can start without a formal permit being granted, no BSL-4 work of any kind, no BSL-3 work. Typically, there are some instances, I'll talk about Cambridge a little bit later on, where there is a separate, more stringent review process for BSL-3 work. Also, large-scale biological work, so anything over 10 liters tends to be restricted. And then sometimes there are restrictions on animal research, sometimes either an outright ban or limits to the type of live animal that's allowed. So to kind of zoom in to the Cambridge, Greater Boston landscape. So right now there are over 20 communities that have rDNA and biosafety permit requirements that cite the NIH guidelines. So this number is always going up, and we're always keeping an eye on these new trends. Many of these are based on the original Cambridge model, but there is a lot of variability to it, as you'll see as I kind of dive deeper into the specific ordinance requirements. A lot of times they require presentations at public meetings. And we've also seen that most of the municipalities that we've worked with over the past year or two have switched over to an online portal system. So most are using the OpenGov system, as opposed to even about 5 years ago, most places were still using a paper system or some sort of email system to submit the application. So things have become more streamlined over the past couple years. Most IBC meetings and local biosafety committee meetings, Board of Health meetings, really since COVID have turned to become pretty much all remote meetings, or sometimes there's an in-person meeting with an option for a hybrid component. So I went over, biosafety permitting a lot, but to touch on fire department permitting as well. So fire department permitting is typically more straightforward because there are less components to it. You don't have to have an IBC meeting. You usually don't need to present to any sort of committee. But I will dive into the specific fire permitting requirements for each city and town. I'll talk about just because the timelines of fire permitting, especially over the past year or two, have increased in length. So it's important, especially if you're moving into a new city or town, to make sure that you understand the lead times of both biosafety and fire department permitting and how that relates to your target research goals, to make sure that all of those things are coming into place. A lot of times we have companies reaching out to us after they've already chosen to move to a particular place, or after they're well into lease negotiations. And it's important, while it's very important to make sure that you're getting the facility that you want in the place that you want. Also important to really from the get-go take a look at the permitting requirements, because you'll see some are a 2 to 3 month permitting process to get. So important to get started as soon as possible, at least with the research part of it. So the biosafety permitting process in Cambridge. So this has been this is the first official biosafety permitting process. It goes very smoothly. Everyone always knows what to expect. There's a presentation in front of the Cambridge Biosafety Committee that happens monthly. We say the average time to permit is about 6 to 8 weeks. There's a facility walkthrough done by the Director of Public Health, and the main piece to remember here is that there is some work that can start before the permit is granted, but that walkthrough does need to take place. And new this year, we're seeing a actual requirement for an air balancing report to be submitted with the application materials to show negative pressure. And before it was more just like a verbal check to make sure that that was happening. But now we're actually seeing an air balancing report being required. So something to think about. So fire department permitting in Cambridge, I would say this for all the cities and towns I've worked in, fire department permitting in Cambridge is the quickest turnaround. So I think the last one I did was like 24 hours from submitting the permit to approval of the permit. There's not an inspection required, but you do need to go into the facility and take pictures of different safety elements and equipment and send them to the fire inspector in lieu of that inspection. There's also an LEPC emergency contact sheet that needs to be sent, which is something that we're seeing that's specific to Cambridge. And you'll see for Cambridge, they require the flammable storage permit and also the compressed gases cryogenic storage permit, which you'll see some of the cities and towns will go over require one or require both, and some also require a lab registration as well. So when you're thinking about moving to these places, again, great idea just to make sure that you're clear on what actual permits you're going to be required to apply for. So biosafety permitting in Boston. So the permit granting authority in Boston is the Boston Public Health Commission. Average time to permit is actually about 12 weeks in total. And this is unique to Boston because in Boston, you won't be issued a biosafety permit unless there is, unless the lab registration process has already been completed. So the regulators of the fire department and the Boston Public Health Commission communicate together to make sure that that timeline happens, but it could be about 12 weeks. So to get started sooner rather than later in Boston is important. There are IBC requirements, and there is an inspection prior to the start of work. So fire department permitting in Boston. So lab registration is required in Boston. The lab registration, to be on the safe side, we say takes about 6 to 10 weeks. There is a building and tenant 414 code compliance report that is required to be completed, which is based off of an EH&S classification document, which is based off of a chemical inventory in Boston. And so in Boston, you're applying for not just flammable storage, but storage of all of the hazardous materials on site. And then in Boston, there are 4 different inspections. So it does take a bit of time to coordinate that. So, if you're thinking about moving to Boston, first thing to do would be to, take a better look at these requirements, and then reach out to a safety consultancy and a code compliance group to make sure that that HMIS and that 414 report is being completed as soon as possible. Also, just wanted to note there's currently a flux between the 9th edition code, which is based on the control area, and the 10th edition code, which is based on lab suites. So it's just important to understand which code your space is being built to, just so that when that compliance report is being built and you're trying to understand the allowable quantities of materials in your space, that everyone in the process is talking the same language, because we have found that it's not necessarily simple to switch back and forth between these codes. So really just important to get your ducks in a row for that before you start the process. Biosafety permitting in Watertown. It takes about 6 to 8 weeks. It's a 2-tiered meeting review. So what this means is there's a presentation in front of the Watertown Biosafety Committee meeting, similar presentation to the Cambridge CBC meeting. It's about a 15 to maybe like a 15-minute summary, followed by a question and answer session of the committee members. And they do thoroughly read and review the submission materials, and there are committee members that are very comfortable with biosafety that will ask relevant questions in the meeting. So IBCs are required, and it's important to note for Watertown, it's a requirement to have 5 members on the IBC. So this means that if you have one of these really small startup companies and you have just like 1 or 2 actual company representatives, you might need to get 2 or 3 community representatives to join your IBC meetings. And fortunately in Watertown, the requirement is that the community representatives for IBCs just have to either live or work in Watertown. So filling these positions for community reps is a little bit simpler than in some other places, but there is that requirement for that 5 members. So important to note too, for your timing for Watertown, the document submission package is required to be submitted 2 weeks prior to the WBSC meeting. So WBSC meetings are usually held on the first Thursday of the month. So getting the materials submitted 2 weeks prior to that means you have to start working on them prior to that, and then making sure that you're holding the IBC meeting in that 2-week window prior to the submission of the materials in order to be able to get the minutes in with that submission package. And then once it's reviewed at the WBSC meeting, it'll go to the Board of Health meeting, which is later on during the month. So that 6 to 8 week lead time in Watertown is real and important to make sure that you're comparing it with your research goals, because if you miss it, then again, you could be back about 6 weeks. So fire department permitting in Watertown. So similar to Boston, they have a very stringent fire department permitting process in Watertown. There's a lab registration required, as well as a flammable storage and a cryogenics and compressed gases storage permit required. Again, just like Boston, all hazardous materials are reported. A 414 report from a code compliance group is required as well. And then there are some unique documents in the submission package for Watertown. There's an EH&S summary with specific hazardous material code specific to Watertown. There's a requirement to add in your fume hood IDs, fire extinguishers, locations, and some other things that we don't typically see in the submission packages for these. There's also a walkthrough, and when the inspector does the walkthrough, it's important to note that it's very thorough. So you can expect for all of the flammables cabinets to be opened, every single fire extinguisher tag to be checked. So important to make sure before those walkthroughs that you're really walking your space, making sure that everything is 100% good to go. In Watertown, chemicals are definitely not allowed on site at all until the walkthrough happens and the permits are issued. So moving on to Waltham. So for Waltham biosafety, it's again a 2-tiered meeting process for the biosafety permits. You first present at the biosafety committee meeting, and then at the next Board of Health meeting, they will grant permission to award the permit at that point. So community reps for Waltham. The requirement used to be that they were not required at the IBC meeting. I think back in the fall of 2024, there was a change made where now there are community representatives required at the meeting. They have to have Waltham residency, and they have to serve as committee members on the meeting. So that's important to note as well. So the fire permit in Waltham is just a 2 to 4 week lead time. Sometimes there's an inspection, sometimes there's not. Depends on what it looks like for the fire department. So you need to reach out to the fire department separately for that. Waltham is one of the only places that I know of that has not switched to any specific online portal for their submission packages. So what they do is they have you fill out a series of PDFs, and then they have you email those to the fire prevention office. The fee is paid online, but most everything else is done just with those paper copies that are emailed. Moving on to Woburn. Woburn is regulated by the Biomedical Oversight Committee. It's about 2 to 3 week lead time for permits. Presentations are by request, and actually IBCs are not required in Woburn. However, it's best practice to do an IBC, and we always recommend that our clients do an IBC, even though it's not a formal requirement in Woburn. And there's no inspection as well. Fire department permitting in Woburn is about 2 to 3 weeks, probably less. There is an inspection, and they use Citizen Serve as their portal for application submission. It's just a little bit different than OpenGov. It's not one that we typically see. So Lexington, so biosafety permitting in Lexington has a very long lead time. So if you're thinking about moving to Lexington, this is definitely something you need to pay attention to. So takes about 60 days. However, it's written into the ordinance that they reserve the right to take 75 days to review the permit materials. We have worked with clients in Lexington in the past, and we've discussed this with the Board of Health, and it's possible to make some arrangements to add in some placeholder documents into the portal so that the Board of Health and the consultant reviewing the permit materials can actually go in and start that review process, so they don't need to wait that whole 75 days. But really, they do have 75 days, and that's significant when you're trying to start lab operations. Community representatives for the IBC meeting. One is actually assigned by the Lexington Board of Health. This is someone who works on the Board of Health that you coordinate to make sure that they can attend the IBC meeting, as well as a Lexington resident or somebody who works in Lexington. And there is an inspection required. However, over the past couple of years, we've seen that these inspections don't necessarily take place before the permit is granted. Sometimes they'll take place 1, 2, or 3 months afterwards as part of more of an annual review cycle. There's a restriction on the culture volumes in Lexington. If it's greater than 5,000 liters, you have to apply for a variance with the city of Lexington. Fire department permitting in Lexington is quick compared to the biosafety permitting, so about 1 to 2 weeks, and they do require an inspection. So NADIC. So NADIC biosafety, this is the newest biosafety regulation in Massachusetts, granted by the NADIC Board of Health. Usually it's just about like 2 to 3 weeks average time to permit. There's no presentation required in front of the Board of Health or Biosafety Committee or anything like that. You do need to have an IBC and submit those documents. And there is potentially an inspection required. However, we haven't seen those taking place yet. The unique feature about the IBCs in NADIC is that there are no community reps required. So it's really just company members that are required to attend the IBC meetings. And in NADIC, there's a blanket ban on any warm-blooded live animal work. So important to think about if you're thinking about considering NADIC and you have some sort of animal work on the horizon. Fire department permitting in NADIC, about 2 to 4 weeks to permit. There is an inspection. It's just a flammables permit in NADIC. This is the first year, or 2024 was the first year that they used OpenGov. There are some unique fields on it to pay attention to that we're not normally used to seeing, like an LP gas inventory, fireworks inventory. So some things don't necessarily apply typically to Biotechs when you're applying. So thinking about other permits in addition to flammables and biosafety, those, I think we go over fire department and biosafety permits just because the submission requirements are lengthy and they vary so much from place to place, but important to get the full picture when you're moving or when you're just starting out. So additional permits include EPA ID registrations, controlled substances, MWRA permits, lasers, x-rays, USDA permits, you name it. So all of these permits have different lead times. we could probably have a lunch and learn on each and every one of these permits, but we're happy to answer questions on lead times or to discuss with you separately. But just wanted to make sure that everyone, considers the whole picture when they're thinking about making these moves. So some trends we're seeing. So really since COVID-19, we're seeing an increased awareness of the public for biosafety. We're seeing that more and more community concerns are being raised, and really to local boards of health across the country. And we're seeing that labs are expanding and they're landing in communities where scientists live. So we saw that with Natick. Most of these are modeled after Cambridge, but again, some of these have some different modifications. We're seeing that there's some traction for the potential for state or federal regulation of biosafety regulations in the future, but we don't see that happening anytime in the near future. And then we see that corporate best practice for larger biotech and life sciences companies still is that best practice IBC biosafety oversight. Does anyone have any questions? Melody, I'm noticing that this text is very small. Would you mind just putting in the chat our phone number and website and email?
Absolutely.
And happy to answer any questions anyone has. Feel free to just rate comments in whatever platform you are listening in on, and we'll be able to see them on our end, or reach out anytime. Happy to help with anything. We are ready to talk about lab moves, lab ops support, anything else safety related that you can think of.
Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to add it to the comments section and we'll answer them here while we're still live. Feel free to add those. We'll give it a minute or two here. It seems your talk was so thorough that no one has questions, Nicole. Thank you. This was very informative. We appreciate this. We appreciate you being here with us, Nicole, and sharing your knowledge. We do these Lunch and Learn events every month. So this was our February Lunch and Learn. Join us next time for our March Lunch and Learn. If you follow our LinkedIn page, you'll see those announcements pop up in your feed. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out. We are always available to you for any regulatory needs you have, any safety consulting needs you have, EH&S. You can email us here at the bottom, the email on the bottom of your screen, info@spotlightsolutions.com. And we are here if you need us. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody.